I never expected that Tuesday afternoon would change everything I thought I knew about power, wealth, and the quiet strength that lives in the most unexpected places. My name is Robert Harrison, and I've spent the last 15 years as head of security for William Montgomery III, one of the most ruthless billionaires in Manhattan. I've seen him negotiate million-dollar deals with ice in his veins, watched him dismiss entire boards of directors with a single gesture, and witnessed him build an empire that spans 3 continents. But I'd never seen him look truly vulnerable, until that day a barefoot little girl walked into his penthouse office. The morning had started like any other in Montgomery's world. The 62nd floor of the Montgomery Tower buzzed with the controlled chaos of high-stakes business. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of Central Park, while the mahogany-paneled office reflected the morning sunlight off its polished surfaces. Montgomery sat behind his massive desk, a monument to success carved from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood, reviewing acquisition reports that would reshape entire industries. At his feet lay Caesar, a 120-pound German shepherd with coal-black fur and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of every betrayal he'd ever witnessed. That dog was Montgomery's most trusted companion, more reliable than any business partner, more loyal than any employee. Caesar had been with him for 8 years, rescued from a fighting ring where he'd learned that survival meant never letting your guard down. Montgomery often joked that Caesar was the only living being who truly understood the price of power. "He bites everyone," Montgomery would tell visitors with that characteristic laugh that never quite reached his eyes, always keeping Caesar's leash wrapped tight around his wrist. "Trust no one, isn't that right, boy?" Caesar would growl low in his throat, a sound that had cleared boardrooms and ended negotiations before they began. I'd seen grown men change their investment strategies just to avoid walking too close to that desk. The irony wasn't lost on me. Montgomery owned 3 mansions scattered across different continents, each worth more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. His primary residence in the Hamptons sprawled across 40 acres of pristine oceanfront property, complete with a private helicopter pad and a staff of 20. His London townhouse in Belgravia had been featured in Architectural Digest twice, and his Swiss chalet commanded views of the Alps that made grown men weep. Beyond real estate, he controlled 10 companies that employed thousands of people, from tech startups in Silicon Valley to manufacturing plants in Detroit. Montgomery Industries, Montgomery Technologies, Montgomery Real Estate Group. His name was stamped across boardrooms and stock exchanges around the world. Yet for all his wealth and influence, the one thing William Montgomery III couldn't buy was the simple human connection that seemed to come so naturally to others. He'd been married twice, both unions ending in bitter divorces that had cost him hundreds of millions. His children from his first marriage spoke to him only through lawyers, their relationship reduced to trust fund distributions and obligatory holiday cards. His social circle consisted entirely of business associates and employees, relationships built on contracts and paychecks rather than genuine affection. Caesar represented the purest form of loyalty Montgomery had ever known. The dog asked for nothing but food and shelter, offered protection without negotiation, and never questioned his master's decisions. In return, Montgomery lavished him with the kind of attention he'd never quite managed to give to the humans in his life. Caesar slept in a custom-built bed that cost more than most people's cars, ate meals prepared by a private chef, and received medical care from Manhattan's most exclusive veterinary practice. But Caesar's loyalty came with a price. Years of protecting Montgomery had turned him into something fierce and unpredictable. Visitors learned quickly to keep their distance, to speak in measured tones, to avoid sudden movements that might trigger his protective instincts. The dog had bitten 3 people in the past year alone. A junior executive who'd reached across the desk too quickly, a cleaning woman who'd accidentally startled him, and a reporter who'd gotten too close during an interview. Each incident had been quietly settled out of court, the victims compensated handsomely for their silence. That Tuesday morning I stood at my usual position near the office entrance, watching Montgomery review quarterly reports, while Caesar maintained his vigilant watch. The routine was as familiar as breathing. I'd positioned myself to observe both the hallway and the office interior, my earpiece crackling occasionally, with updates from the security team stationed throughout the building. Montgomery's assistant, Patricia, buzzed in with reminders about his afternoon schedule, her voice carefully neutral as she navigated around the invisible barriers that Caesar's presence created. "The Shanghai team is requesting a video conference at 3, she announced through the intercom, her tone suggesting she'd already cleared the schedule without waiting for approval. Patricia had worked for Montgomery for 12 years, long enough to anticipate his decisions and understand that questioning them was pointless. She'd learned to communicate with him through careful inflection and strategic pauses, a skill that had made her invaluable in his carefully orchestrated world. Montgomery glanced up from his reports, his steel-gray eyes scanning the documents with the precision of a man who'd built his fortune on attention to detail. At 57, he maintained the sharp appearance of someone who understood that image was everything in his world. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his Italian suit tailored to mask the slight softening that age had brought to his frame. But it was his hands that told the real story. They were constantly moving, adjusting his tie, straightening papers, reaching down to stroke Caesar's head. Those hands betrayed the restless energy of someone who'd never learned how to be still. "Reschedule it for 4. He replied without looking up, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. "And Patricia, make sure the building management knows we're having the monthly board meeting tomorrow. I want extra security on the lobby level." "Already arranged, sir," she responded, and I caught the slight smile in her voice. Patricia took pride in staying 2 steps ahead of Montgomery's requests, a skill that had made her indispensable in a world where anticipation was more valuable than reaction. The morning proceeded with mechanical precision. Montgomery fielded calls from Tokyo, London, and São Paulo, each conversation conducted in the clipped, efficient tone that had become his trademark. He negotiated acquisitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars with the same emotional detachment he might use to order lunch. Caesar remained at his side throughout, occasionally lifting his head when voices on the speakerphone rose above their usual measured tones. During a particularly intense negotiation with a manufacturing consortium in Germany, I watched Montgomery's free hand absently stroke Caesar's head, while his voice remained cold and calculating. The dog's presence seemed to anchor him, providing a steady rhythm in the chaos of international business. It was a ritual I'd observed countless times, Montgomery drawing strength from the animal's unwavering loyalty, while maintaining the emotional distance that had made him successful. Around noon, Montgomery's personal chef arrived with lunch, a precisely prepared meal that reflected his obsession with control. Even his nutrition was planned weeks in advance, each component selected for optimal energy and mental clarity. Caesar received his own portion, a carefully balanced meal that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. The dog ate with the same methodical precision as his master, both of them maintaining their respective routines with clockwork accuracy. As the afternoon wore on, I noticed Montgomery becoming increasingly agitated. A deal he'd been orchestrating for months was encountering unexpected resistance, and his usually perfect composure was beginning to crack. He paced behind his desk, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor, while Caesar watched with growing alertness. The dog could sense his master's mood shifting, his ears perked forward and his body tensed as if preparing for some unseen threat. "These people don't understand the value of what I'm offering," Montgomery muttered, more to himself than to anyone in the room. They're too concerned with sentiment to see the opportunity right in front of them. His voice carried the frustration of someone who'd spent decades believing that every problem could be solved with enough money and pressure. It was Patricia's voice through the intercom that first alerted us to something unusual. "Mr. Montgomery, there's a situation in the lobby that requires your attention." Her carefully controlled tone couldn't quite mask the uncertainty underneath. In 12 years of working for him, she'd handled everything from hostile takeovers to death threats with unflappable professionalism. For her to sound even slightly unsettled meant something genuinely unusual was happening. "What kind of situation?" Montgomery's voice carried the sharp edge it always took on when his carefully ordered world was disrupted. He'd built his empire on predictability and control, and unexpected situations represented the kind of chaos he'd spent his life trying to eliminate. "It's difficult to explain, sir. Perhaps you should come down and see for yourself." I saw Montgomery's jaw tighten, a tell that indicated his patience was reaching its limit. He'd been dealing with setbacks all morning, and the last thing he needed was another problem that couldn't be solved with a simple command. But Patricia's judgment had proven reliable over the years, and her request carried enough weight to override his irritation. "Robert, you're with me," he said, reaching for Caesar's leash. "Let's go see what's so important that it can't be handled without my personal intervention." The elevator ride to the lobby was silent, except for the soft hum of machinery and Caesar's steady breathing. Montgomery stood with his characteristic rigid posture, his hand maintaining its firm grip on the leash, while his eyes stared straight ahead. I positioned myself in the corner where I could observe both Montgomery and the elevator doors, my training keeping me alert to any potential threat. In the confined space, Caesar's presence seemed even more imposing, his black coat gleaming under the fluorescent lights. When the elevator doors opened, we stepped into a scene that defied every security protocol I'd helped establish. The Montgomery Tower lobby was a monument to intimidation, with its soaring ceilings, marble columns, and the kind of cold grandeur that made visitors feel small and insignificant. On most days, it hummed with the quiet efficiency of serious business, everyone moving with purpose and speaking in hushed tones that reflected the weight of the decisions being made in the floors above. But today, the entire space seemed to have stopped. Security guards stood in a loose circle around something near the information desk, their usual professional demeanor replaced by an uncertainty I'd never seen before. The morning foot traffic of executives and visitors had slowed to a crawl, people pausing to stare at whatever had captured the guards' attention. The polished marble floors reflected the confusion in the air, and even the building's ambient sounds seemed muted. As we approached the cluster of guards, I could see the source of their bewilderment. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, in the center of their circle was a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair that looked like it hadn't seen a brush in days. Her clothes were clean but worn, the kind of garments that suggested careful maintenance rather than regular replacement. But it was her feet that immediately drew my attention. She was completely barefoot, her small toes curled against the cold marble. "Back off, kid. This isn't your place," I heard one of the guards say, his voice carrying the authority of someone trained to maintain order in a world where chaos was always just one disruption away. James Morrison had been with Montgomery Security for 6 years, and I'd never seen him look so uncertain. His usual confidence was replaced by the kind of hesitation that came from encountering a problem that couldn't be solved with standard procedures. The little girl didn't seem intimidated by the circle of uniformed men surrounding her. Instead, she looked around the opulent lobby with the kind of wonder that most adults had long since forgotten how to feel. Her eyes took in the marble columns, the crystal chandeliers, the expensive artwork that Montgomery had collected over the years. But there was something else in her expression, a sadness that seemed too deep for someone so young. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said, her voice carrying a maturity that didn't match her appearance. "I just wanted to see the pretty building. Someone told me the man who lives at the top has a dog that's very sad." Montgomery's grip on Caesar's leash tightened, and I could see the familiar mask of control sliding into place. This was exactly the kind of disruption he despised. Something unexpected. Something that couldn't be managed with money or authority. The little girl represented chaos in his ordered world, and I could practically feel his irritation rising. "What's your name, kid?" Montgomery asked, his voice carrying the cold authority that had intimidated heads of state and corporate executives. "And where are your parents?" The girl looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her face. "My name is Emma," she said simply, "and I don't have parents anymore. The lady at the shelter said they went to heaven, but I think they just got too tired to take care of me." The simplicity of her statement hit the lobby like a physical force. I watched Montgomery's expression shift slightly, something flickering behind his usual mask of control. Caesar, who had been growling low in his throat since we'd approached the group, suddenly went quiet. The dog's attention was focused entirely on the little girl, his ears forward, and his body tense. "This is a private building," Montgomery said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "You can't just wander in here. Where are you supposed to be?" Emma looked around the circle of guards, then back at Montgomery. "I was staying with Mrs. Rodriguez at the shelter, but she said I might find a new family soon. I wanted to see the sad dog first, though. Animals understand things that people don't." It was then that she did something that would replay in my memory for years to come. Without asking permission, without showing any fear of the growling German shepherd that had terrified countless adults, Emma slowly stood up and began walking toward Caesar. Every guard in the circle tensed, hands moving instinctively toward their equipment. I felt my own body preparing to intervene, knowing that Caesar's protective instincts made him unpredictable around strangers. "Stop right there," I called out, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years managing security in high-stakes situations. "That dog is not friendly to strangers." But Emma didn't stop. She walked with the kind of calm confidence that suggested she'd been around animals her entire life, her bare feet making no sound on the marble floor. Caesar's growling intensified, his body coiled like a spring ready to release. Montgomery's knuckles were white where he gripped the leash, his entire body tense with the effort of controlling 90 pounds of protective instinct. "He bites everyone," Montgomery said, his voice carrying a warning that was equal parts concern and challenge. "I'm not kidding, kid. This isn't a pet. He's a guard dog, and he doesn't like strangers." Emma stopped about 3 feet away from Caesar, close enough that the dog's growling filled the air around her. For a moment, the entire lobby held its breath. I could see Montgomery's security team positioning themselves for whatever might happen next, their training warring with the surreal nature of the situation. Then Emma did something that defied every instinct I'd developed in 15 years of security work. She knelt down slowly, bringing herself to Caesar's eye level, and simply waited. She didn't try to touch him, didn't make any sudden movements, didn't speak. She just knelt there, her small hands resting on her knees, looking directly into the dog's eyes with an expression of infinite patience. The growling didn't stop immediately. Caesar continued to watch her with the wariness of an animal that had learned to trust no one except his master. But something in Emma's posture, in the way she held herself completely still, seemed to communicate something that went beyond words. She wasn't trying to dominate or control him. She was simply present, offering herself as she was without asking for anything in return. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Caesar's growling began to soften. His ears, which had been pinned back against his head, started to relax. The rigid tension in his body began to ease, replaced by a cautious curiosity that I'd never seen him display toward a stranger. Emma remained perfectly still, her breathing slow and steady, her eyes never leaving the dog's face. Then she spoke, her voice so quiet that I had to strain to hear it over the ambient noise of the lobby. "I know you're scared," she whispered, her words carrying a gentleness that seemed to wrap around Caesar like a warm blanket. "I know you think everyone wants to hurt you, but I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here because I understand what it's like to be alone." The transformation was immediate and profound. Caesar's growling stopped completely, replaced by the kind of silence that felt electric, with possibility. His tail, which had been tucked between his legs, began to move slowly from side to side. For the first time in the 8 years I'd known him, Caesar's defensive posture melted away, replaced by something that looked remarkably like hope. Emma continued to speak in that same gentle whisper, her words creating a bubble of intimacy in the vast marble lobby. "I know what it's like to watch everyone walk by without seeing you. I know what it's like to be hungry and scared and not know if anyone will ever love you again. But you're not alone now. I see you." I watched Montgomery's face as Emma spoke, saw something crack in his carefully constructed armor. His grip on Caesar's leash had loosened unconsciously, and for the first time in years, he seemed to be seeing his dog as something more than just a symbol of power and protection. The vulnerability in Emma's voice was reflecting something back to him, something he'd buried so deep that he'd forgotten it existed. Caesar took a tentative step forward, his nose stretched toward Emma's outstretched hand. She didn't move to pet him, didn't try to rush the connection. Instead, she let him approach at his own pace, her hand steady and open. When Caesar's nose finally touched her palm, the gentle contact seemed to complete some kind of circuit that had been broken for years. "That's it," Emma whispered, her voice filled with a joy that transformed her entire face. "You're such a good boy. You've been protecting everyone for so long, but you don't have to protect yourself from me. What happened next will remain one of the most extraordinary moments of my professional career." Caesar, the dog who had bitten 3 people in the past year, who growled at cleaning staff and intimidated boardroom executives, slowly lowered himself to the ground and rolled onto his back. It was a gesture of complete trust, the kind of vulnerability that dogs only show to those they consider family. Emma's face lit up with a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire lobby. She began to gently rub Caesar's belly, her small hands moving with the practiced skill of someone who had spent countless hours comforting frightened animals. Caesar's tail wagged with increasing enthusiasm, his tongue lolling out of his mouth in an expression of pure contentment. "I told him I'm not here to hurt him," Emma said, looking up at Montgomery with eyes that held no judgment, only understanding. "Same thing I tell people when they're scared of me." The silence that followed her words was profound. I could see Montgomery struggling with something, his usual confidence replaced by a bewilderment that seemed to shake him to his core. This little girl, with her bare feet and second-hand clothes, had accomplished something that no amount of training or veterinary intervention had been able to achieve. She had reached through Caesar's defenses and found the frightened animal underneath. Montgomery's voice, when he finally spoke, was different from anything I'd heard in 15 years of working for him. The cold authority was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like awe. "What did you say to him?" Emma continued to pet Caesar, her movements generating a steady rhythm of contentment from the dog. "I told him that I understand what it's like to be scared. I told him that sometimes when people are mean to you, it's because they're scared too. And I told him that being strong doesn't mean you can't be gentle." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything Montgomery had built his life around. I could see him processing what he'd witnessed, trying to fit it into the framework of power and control that had defined his existence. But Emma's simple act of connection had revealed something that all his wealth and influence couldn't buy, the transformative power of genuine understanding. Montgomery reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his leather wallet, a gesture I'd seen him make countless times when faced with problems that money could solve. "How much do you want?" he asked, his voice carrying the automatic assumption that everything had a price. "Name your figure." Emma looked up at him with confusion, her hand still resting on Caesar's belly. "I don't want money," she said simply. "I want dog food." The request was so unexpected that Montgomery actually took a step back. "Dog food? There are lots of dogs at the shelter where I stay," Emma explained, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing an obvious truth. "They don't have enough food for all of them, and some of the dogs are really skinny. If you have money, maybe you could buy them food instead of giving it to me." I watched Montgomery's face as he processed this request, saw him struggling with the concept of someone refusing his money in favor of helping others. In his world, generosity was a strategic tool, charity, a tax write-off. But Emma's request came from a place of pure compassion, untainted by calculation or self-interest. "You want me to buy dog food for a shelter?" he asked, his voice carrying a disbelief that was almost comical. "Instead of taking money for yourself?" Emma nodded, her attention returning to Caesar, who was now completely relaxed under her gentle touch. "Money won't help me much, but the dogs are really hungry. And Caesar here looks like he has plenty of good food already." The simplicity of her logic was devastating in its clarity. Montgomery, who had spent decades accumulating wealth and power, was being shown by a barefoot 8-year-old that generosity wasn't about what you could get in return. It was about using whatever resources you had to help those who needed it most. I could see the exact moment when something shifted in Montgomery's expression. The mask of control that he wore so habitually began to crack, revealing glimpses of the man underneath. For perhaps the first time in years, he was seeing his wealth not as a tool for domination, but as a means of creating genuine impact in the world. "Patricia," he said, his voice carrying an unusual gentleness as he spoke into his phone, "I need you to contact every animal shelter in the city. I want to arrange for food donations, medical supplies, whatever they need, and I want it done today." Emma looked up at him with eyes that sparkled with gratitude. "Really? You'll help them?" "I'll help them," Montgomery confirmed, and I could hear something in his voice that I hadn't heard in years. Genuine warmth. "But I want to ask you something first. How did you know about Caesar? How did you know he was sad?" Emma's expression grew thoughtful, as if she was trying to find words for something that went beyond normal explanation. "I lived with Dr. Martinez for a while," she said finally. "She's a veterinarian who takes care of street animals. She taught me that animals carry pain just like people do, and sometimes they need someone to see past their anger to the hurt underneath." The revelation hit Montgomery like a physical blow. Emma wasn't just some random child who had wandered into his building. She was someone who had been shaped by loss and hardship, someone who had learned to see suffering because she understood it intimately. Her ability to connect with Caesar wasn't magic. It was hard-won wisdom earned through experience that no child should have to endure. "Dr. Martinez," Montgomery repeated, his voice carrying a new respect. "Is she still taking care of you?" Emma shook her head, her expression growing sad. "She got sick and had to go to the hospital. That's when I went to the shelter. But she taught me that animals are just like people. They need to know that someone sees them, that someone cares about them." I watched Montgomery absorb this information, saw him beginning to understand that Emma's gift wasn't supernatural. It was the result of someone who had learned to recognize pain because she had lived with it. Her empathy had been forged in the crucible of loss, shaped by mentors who had taught her that healing required presence, not power. Caesar had rolled back onto his stomach but remained lying down, his head resting on his paws, while Emma continued to pet him. The transformation in the dog was remarkable. The constant tension that had defined his posture for years was gone, replaced by a relaxation that seemed to emanate from his very bones. His eyes, which had always held a wariness that bordered on aggression, now looked peaceful. "How long have you been at the shelter?" Montgomery asked, his voice carrying a gentleness that his employees would never have recognized. "About 3 months," Emma replied, her attention still focused on Caesar. "Mrs. Rodriguez says I'm on a list for families who might want to adopt me. But there are lots of kids who need homes. I don't mind waiting, though. The dogs need someone to play with them." The casual way she spoke about her own uncertain future while focusing on the needs of others was perhaps the most heartbreaking thing I'd ever witnessed. Emma had been failed by every system designed to protect her, yet she had somehow emerged with her capacity for compassion intact. She was more concerned about hungry dogs than her own need for a permanent home. Montgomery was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. Caesar was now completely relaxed, his tail wagging gently as Emma scratched behind his ears. The dog who had terrorized boardrooms and intimidated visitors was displaying a gentleness that I hadn't known he possessed. "Emma," Montgomery said finally, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he was about to say something important. "Would you like to see the rest of the building? I have some things I think you might find interesting." Emma looked up at him with curiosity, her hand still resting on Caesar's head. "Are you sure?" "Your security guard said this wasn't my place." Montgomery's expression hardened slightly as he looked at James Morrison, who had been standing silently throughout the entire exchange. "This building belongs to me," he said, his voice carrying just enough authority to remind everyone who was in charge. "And I say, you're welcome here." The elevator ride to the 60th floor was unlike any I'd experienced in my 15 years of working for Montgomery. Emma stood beside him, her bare feet barely making contact with the elevator floor, while Caesar pressed against her legs with the devotion of a dog who had found something precious. Montgomery watched this interaction with an expression I'd never seen before, something that looked almost like wonder. "Why don't you have shoes?" Montgomery asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Emma looked down at her feet, then back up at him. "I outgrew my last pair about a month ago. Mrs. Rodriguez said we'd get new ones when the donations came in, but there are younger kids who need them more than I do." The matter-of-fact way she spoke about her own deprivation while prioritizing others' needs was becoming a pattern that Montgomery was clearly struggling to understand. In his world, need was met with immediate acquisition. If something was required, it was purchased. The concept of going without while others were prioritized was foreign to his experience. When the elevator doors opened onto the 60th floor, Emma stepped into Montgomery's office with the same wide-eyed wonder she'd shown in the lobby. The floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the sprawling cityscape beyond, while the expensive furnishings spoke of wealth that most people could only imagine. But it was the office's scale that seemed to impress her most. The sheer size of the space, the way her voice echoed slightly when she spoke. "This is where you work?" she asked, her voice filled with awe. "It's like a palace." Montgomery looked around his office as if seeing it for the first time. The mahogany desk, the leather chairs, the artwork that cost more than most people's annual salaries. All of it suddenly seemed excessive when viewed through Emma's eyes. "I suppose it is rather large," he said, his voice carrying a self-consciousness that was entirely new. Emma walked to the windows, her reflection small and fragile against the vast expanse of glass. "You can see everything from up here," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "All the people, all the cars, all the buildings. It must be like being God." The innocent comparison made Montgomery visibly uncomfortable. "I'm not God," he said quickly. "I'm just a businessman, Emma turned away from the window to look at him directly. "But you can help people from up here, right? You can see who needs help and then do something about it?" The question cut to the heart of something Montgomery had been avoiding for years. His wealth and position gave him the power to create change on a massive scale. But he'd chosen to use that power primarily for his own benefit. Emma's simple question forced him to confront the gap between his capabilities and his actions. "I suppose I could," he said finally, his voice carrying a thoughtfulness that suggested he was genuinely considering the possibility. Emma walked over to Caesar, who had settled himself near Montgomery's desk, with a contentment that transformed his entire demeanor. The dog's tail wagged as she approached, his eyes bright with an affection that seemed to surprise even him. "Caesar knows you're a good person," she said, settling cross-legged on the floor beside the dog. Animals can tell things about people that people can't see themselves. Montgomery sat down in his chair, his usual commanding presence somehow diminished by Emma's simple presence. "What do you mean?" "Dr. Martinez used to say that animals see people's hearts, not their faces," Emma explained, her hands gently stroking Caesar's fur. "Caesar is protective because he loves you, but he's also sad because he thinks you're sad. Animals reflect what they feel from their people." The observation was so astute that Montgomery actually leaned forward, his business-trained mind trying to process the implications. "You think I'm sad?" Emma looked up at him with eyes that held no judgment, only understanding. "I think you're lonely," she said simply. "Just like Caesar was lonely. Just like I get lonely sometimes. But lonely doesn't mean bad. It just means you haven't found the right people to not be lonely with." The words hit Montgomery with the force of a revelation. For decades, he'd surrounded himself with employees, business associates, and acquaintances. But none of them had ever seen past his wealth and power to the person underneath. Emma, with her child's clarity, had identified something that he'd been too proud or too scared to acknowledge. "How do you know so much about loneliness?" he asked, his voice gentler than I'd ever heard it. Emma's expression grew thoughtful. "When you don't have parents, you learn about being alone. But, Doctor, Martinez taught me that being alone and being lonely are different things. Being alone is just a situation, but being lonely is a feeling. And feelings can change when you find the right connections." The wisdom in her words was staggering. This 8-year-old girl, who had every reason to be bitter about her circumstances, had somehow developed an understanding of human nature that exceeded that of most adults. Her losses had taught her empathy, her struggles had given her perspective, and her exposure to animals had shown her the power of unconditional love. Montgomery was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on Emma as she continued to pet Caesar. The dog's transformation was remarkable. The constant vigilance that had defined his behavior for years was gone, replaced by a peace that seemed to emanate from his entire being. For the first time since I'd known him, Caesar looked genuinely happy. "Emma," Montgomery said finally, his voice carrying a hesitancy that suggested he was about to venture into unfamiliar territory. "Would you like to stay for dinner? I could have my chef prepare something special, and we could get you some shoes that fit properly." Emma looked up at him with surprise. "Are you sure? I don't want to be any trouble." "You're not trouble," Montgomery said firmly. You're probably the most interesting person I've met in years." The evening that followed was unlike anything I'd witnessed in my time with Montgomery. Emma's presence transformed the normally sterile office environment into something that felt almost like home. She asked questions about everything: the artwork on the walls, the view from the windows, the various gadgets and devices that filled Montgomery's world. But more importantly, she listened to his answers with the kind of attention that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with genuine interest. During dinner, which was served in the office's private dining area, Emma told Montgomery about her life with Dr. Martinez. She described the makeshift animal clinic where she'd learned to hold frightened cats while they received medical care, the way she'd helped feed abandoned puppies, and the lessons she'd learned about the connection between healing and presence. Dr. Martinez used to say that the best medicine isn't always pills or surgery, Emma explained, her voice carrying the cadence of someone repeating beloved wisdom. Sometimes it's just sitting with someone who's hurt and letting them know they're not alone. Montgomery listened with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing every word. The successful businessman who had built his empire on calculated decisions and strategic thinking was being educated by a child who had learned her lessons from the streets and animal shelters. "What happened to Dr. Martinez?" Montgomery asked, his voice carrying a concern that would have surprised his employees. Emma's expression grew sad. "She got really sick and had to go to a special hospital. Mrs. Rodriguez at the shelter said the doctors are trying to help her, but she might not get better. That's when I had to leave her house and go to the shelter." The casual way Emma spoke about another loss in her young life was heartbreaking. She had clearly learned to adapt to disappointment, to find ways to continue caring for others even when her own support systems failed. Her resilience was remarkable, but it came at a cost that no child should have to pay. "Would you like to see her?" Montgomery asked suddenly, his voice carrying a determination that I recognized from his most important business decisions. "I could arrange for transportation, make sure she has the best medical care available." Emma's face lit up with a hope that was almost painful to witness. "Really? You could do that?" "I can do a lot of things," Montgomery said, and for the first time in years, his power felt like a tool for good rather than just a means of control. "But first, I want to make sure you have everything you need. Shoes, clothes, a place to stay that's better than a shelter." Emma looked down at Caesar, who had positioned himself at her feet and was watching her with devotion. "Could I bring Caesar to visit Dr. Martinez? I think she'd like to meet him." The question revealed something beautiful about Emma's character. Even in the face of her own good fortune, she was thinking about how to share it with others. She wasn't interested in Montgomery's wealth for its own sake, but for the connections and healing it could create. "Of course," Montgomery said, his voice carrying a warmth that transformed his entire demeanor. Caesar would probably enjoy the visit, too. As the evening progressed, I watched Montgomery undergo a transformation that paralleled the one Emma had created in Caesar. The rigid control that had defined his every interaction began to soften, replaced by something that looked remarkably like genuine happiness. He laughed at Emma's observations about the city lights, listened intently to her stories about the animals at the shelter, and even joined her on the floor to pet Caesar. The sight of William Montgomery III, one of the most powerful men in Manhattan, sitting cross-legged on his office floor while an 8-year-old girl taught him how to properly scratch a dog's ears, was something that would have been impossible to imagine just hours earlier. But there he was, his expensive suit wrinkled from sitting on the floor, his perfectly styled hair slightly mussed, laughing with genuine delight as Caesar rolled over to expose his belly for more attention. "He really trusts you?" Emma said, her voice filled with wonder as she watched Montgomery's tentative attempts to connect with his own dog. "He's never been this relaxed around anyone except you, has he?" Montgomery paused in his petting, his expression growing thoughtful. "Actually, he's never been this relaxed around me either. He's always been protective, vigilant. I thought that was just his nature." Emma looked up at him with eyes that held years of hard-won wisdom. Animals become what they think they need to be for their people. If Caesar was always watching for danger, maybe it's because he thought you needed him to be strong all the time. The observation hit Montgomery like a physical blow. For 8 years, he'd praised Caesar's aggressive protectiveness, had used the dog's intimidating presence as a tool in his business dealings. He'd never considered that Caesar might have been reflecting his own emotional state, that the dog's constant vigilance might have been a response to the fear and isolation that Montgomery had been carrying for decades. "So, you're saying he was protecting me from something he sensed I was afraid of?" Montgomery asked, his voice carrying a vulnerability that I'd never heard before. Emma nodded, her small hand continuing to stroke Caesar's fur. "Dogs don't lie about feelings. They can't pretend to be something they're not. If Caesar was always scared that someone would hurt you, it's because he could feel that you were scared of being hurt." The truth of her words was undeniable. Montgomery had spent years building walls around himself, using his wealth and power to keep people at a distance. He'd convinced himself that this isolation was strength, that needing others was weakness. But Caesar had been absorbing all of that fear and loneliness, transforming it into the protective aggression that had defined his behavior. "I never thought about it that way," Montgomery said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man recognizing something fundamental about himself. "I always assumed I was protecting him by keeping him close, by making sure he was never vulnerable." Emma smiled with the kind of understanding that seemed far too mature for her age. Sometimes protecting someone means letting them be happy, even if it feels scary. Caesar was protecting you, but he was also protecting himself from caring too much, because caring hurts when you think it might be taken away. The parallel between Caesar's behavior and Montgomery's own approach to relationships was so obvious that I could see the recognition dawning in his eyes. He'd spent decades keeping people at arm's length, using his wealth and power to maintain emotional distance. Like Caesar, he'd learned that vulnerability was dangerous, that caring too much inevitably led to pain. "Emma," Montgomery said suddenly, his voice carrying a determination that I recognized from his most important business decisions. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it carefully before you answer." Emma looked up at him with curiosity, her hand still resting on Caesar's head. "Okay. Would you like to stay here? Not just for tonight, but permanently. I have plenty of room, and I think Caesar would like having you around, and I think I would too." The offer hung in the air between them, weighted with possibilities that neither of them had considered just hours earlier. Emma's eyes widened with surprise, then filled with something that looked like hope, tempered by caution. "You mean like a family?" she asked, her voice carrying a yearning that broke my heart. Montgomery's expression softened with an emotion I'd never seen him display. "I don't know much about being a family," he said honestly. "I've never been very good at it. But I think you could teach me, the same way you taught Caesar that it's okay to let his guard down." Emma was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving between Montgomery and Caesar, as if trying to read some deeper truth in their faces. "What about the people who make decisions about kids like me? Don't they have to say it's okay? I have very good lawyers," Montgomery said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with enough resources. "And I have references that most people would find impressive. But more importantly, I think I can provide you with something that goes beyond just money and security." "What's that?" Emma asked, her voice carrying genuine curiosity. Montgomery looked down at Caesar, who was now sleeping peacefully with his head resting on Emma's lap. "I can provide you with a place where you belong, where you don't have to prove your worth or compete for attention, where you can just be yourself, and that's enough." The promise was perhaps the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard Montgomery say. For a man who had spent his entire adult life measuring worth in terms of profit and loss, the concept of unconditional belonging was revolutionary. Emma had shown him that value wasn't always quantifiable, that some of the most important things in life couldn't be bought or sold. Emma's response was immediate and heartfelt. "I'd like that," she said, her voice carrying a joy that seemed to illuminate the entire room. "I'd like that very much." What followed was a whirlwind of activity that demonstrated Montgomery's ability to make things happen when he was truly motivated. Phone calls were made to lawyers, social workers, and administrators. Documents were expedited, references were provided, and the full weight of Montgomery's influence was brought to bear on the adoption process. But more importantly, Montgomery began to change in ways that went far beyond legal paperwork. He arranged for Emma to have her own room in his penthouse apartment, complete with everything a young girl could need. He hired tutors to help her catch up on the education she'd missed during her time in the system. He even arranged for Dr. Martinez to receive the best medical care available, bringing her to a private facility where Emma could visit her regularly. The transformation in Caesar was equally remarkable. With Emma's daily presence, the dog's aggressive protectiveness gave way to a gentle playfulness that had been buried under years of anxiety. He learned to enjoy simple pleasures, games of fetch in the penthouse's private garden, lazy afternoons napping in sunny spots, the joy of unconditional affection without the constant need for vigilance. But perhaps the most significant change was in Montgomery himself. The cold efficiency that had defined his business dealings began to soften, replaced by a consideration for how his decisions affected others. He started asking questions about his employees' families, began implementing policies that prioritized work-life balance, and even established a foundation dedicated to supporting animal shelters and children's services. The first time I saw Montgomery laugh, really laugh, not the calculating chuckle he used in business meetings, was during a dinner conversation with Emma about her day at school. She was telling him about a science project involving plant growth, and her enthusiasm was so infectious that his usual reserve completely melted away. The sound of his genuine laughter was so unfamiliar that I almost didn't recognize it. 6 months after Emma's arrival, Montgomery's office had been transformed from a sterile monument to success into something that felt genuinely welcoming. Emma's artwork decorated the walls alongside his expensive paintings. Caesar's dog bed was positioned near the desk where he could observe the daily business while remaining relaxed, and the entire space seemed to hum with a warmth that had been absent for years. I watched Montgomery conduct a particularly tense negotiation with a group of international investors, his usual sharp-edged authority tempered by something that looked remarkably like wisdom. When the other party attempted to pressure him into accepting unfavorable terms, his response was firm but not cruel, strategic but not ruthless. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who no longer needed to prove his worth through dominance. "I understand your position, but I've learned that the best deals are the ones where everyone walks away feeling respected. Let's find a solution that works for all of us." The change in his negotiating style was subtle but profound. He was still formidable, still capable of driving hard bargains, but his approach now reflected an understanding that business was ultimately about human relationships. Emma had taught him that power used wisely could create connection rather than fear, that strength could be gentle without being weak. During our lunch break, Montgomery called Emma's school to check on her progress, a daily ritual that had become as important to him as reviewing stock prices. His voice carried a warmth that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier as he listened to her teacher's report about her improving grades and growing confidence. "She's really thriving," he told me after ending the call, his expression filled with a pride that had nothing to do with financial success. "Her reading level has improved dramatically, and she's making friends with other children. Dr. Martinez says Emma talks about feeling safe for the first time in years." The mention of Dr. Martinez brought a smile to Montgomery's face. The veterinarian had made a full recovery, thanks to the medical care Montgomery had provided, and she'd become a regular visitor to the penthouse. Her presence had created a bridge between Emma's past and present, helping her integrate her experiences while building toward a more stable future. Dr. Martinez is teaching Emma about animal behavior in a more structured way, Montgomery continued, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone discovering new possibilities. She thinks Emma might have real talent for veterinary work, maybe even research. I've been thinking about establishing a scholarship program for kids who want to work with animals. The idea was quintessentially Montgomery, taking a personal experience and scaling it into something that could help others. But unlike his previous philanthropic efforts, which had been primarily about tax benefits and public relations, this came from a place of genuine caring. Emma had shown him that helping others wasn't just about writing checks, but about creating opportunities for connection and growth. As the afternoon progressed, I observed Montgomery's interactions with his staff and noticed how his changed perspective was affecting the entire office environment. He listened more carefully to his employees' concerns, asked follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine interest, and even implemented a policy allowing staff to bring their pets to work on designated days. The transformation wasn't without its challenges. Montgomery still struggled with vulnerability, still occasionally reverted to his old patterns of control when stress levels rose. But Emma's presence provided a constant reminder that strength could coexist with gentleness, that power was most effective when it was used to lift others up rather than maintain dominance. One evening, as we were preparing to leave the office, Montgomery paused at his desk to look at a framed photograph that had appeared there recently. It showed Emma and Caesar playing in Central Park, both of them laughing with pure joy. The image captured something that no amount of money could buy: the simple happiness that comes from being truly seen and accepted. "You know, Robert," Montgomery said, his voice carrying a reflectiveness that had become more common in recent months. "I spent 40 years building this empire, accumulating wealth and power that I thought would make me happy. But I was measuring success by all the wrong metrics." He picked up the photograph, studying it with the kind of attention he used to reserve for financial reports. "Emma taught me that real wealth isn't about what you own. It's about the connections you make. Caesar taught me that loyalty isn't something you can demand. It's something you earn through consistency and care." The insight was profound, representing a fundamental shift in how Montgomery understood his own life. Success was no longer measured solely in terms of profit margins and market dominance, but in the quality of relationships and the positive impact he could have on others. As we rode the elevator down to the lobby, Caesar walked calmly beside us without a leash, his former aggression replaced by a confidence that came from knowing he was loved rather than just needed. The dog's transformation served as a daily reminder of what was possible when fear was replaced by trust, when protection came from love rather than intimidation. The lobby that had once been a sterile monument to corporate power now felt warmer, more welcoming. Montgomery had implemented changes that made the space more accessible to families, had hired staff who understood that the building's primary purpose was to serve people rather than intimidate them. Emma was waiting for us near the information desk, her school backpack slung over her shoulder and a bright smile on her face. At 8 years old, she had grown more confident and outgoing, but she still retained the wisdom and empathy that had first drawn Montgomery to her. Her presence had not only transformed his life, but had rippled outward to affect everyone who worked in the building. "How was school today?" Montgomery asked, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who genuinely cared about the answer. "We learned about photosynthesis," Emma replied, her enthusiasm infectious. "Did you know that plants basically eat sunlight? It's like they're solar panels, but alive." Montgomery laughed, the sound now natural and unforced. "That's amazing! Maybe we should visit the botanical garden this weekend so you can see some examples up close." As we walked toward the exit, Caesar trotting happily beside Emma, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation I'd witnessed. 6 months ago, Montgomery had been one of the most isolated people I'd ever known, surrounded by wealth and power, but lacking the human connections that give life meaning. Emma had shown him that true strength came not from dominance, but from vulnerability, not from control, but from connection. The evening air was crisp as we stepped onto the sidewalk, the city lights beginning to twinkle in the approaching dusk. Montgomery's driver waited with the car, but instead of immediately getting in, Montgomery paused to look back at the building that housed his empire. "You know what I realized today?" he said, his voice carrying a contentment that had been absent for years. "I used to think that building represented my success, that all those floors and offices and employees were proof of my worth. But I was looking at it all wrong." Emma looked up at him with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Montgomery smiled, reaching down to take her hand. "I mean that a building is just a building, and money is just money. The real success is right here. You, me, Caesar, the family we've become. Everything else is just details." The simple truth of his words resonated in the evening air. Montgomery had discovered what Emma had known all along. That connection was more valuable than possession, that love was more powerful than fear, that the most important things in life couldn't be bought or sold. As we climbed into the car, Caesar settled contentedly between Montgomery and Emma, his tail wagging gently as he looked out the window at the passing city. The dog who had once been a symbol of aggressive protection had become a representation of something far more powerful. The peace that comes from knowing you are loved not for what you can do, but for who you are. The drive to Montgomery's penthouse was filled with Emma's chatter about her day, her plans for the weekend, and her excitement about an upcoming visit to Dr. Martinez. Montgomery listened with the kind of attention that had once been reserved for the most important business calls, his responses thoughtful and engaged. When we arrived at the building, the doorman greeted Emma by name, his face lighting up with genuine affection. She had become a favorite among the staff, her kindness and curiosity creating connections that bridged the gap between Montgomery's isolated world and the broader community around him. The penthouse itself had been transformed to accommodate Emma's presence. What had once been a sterile showcase of expensive furniture and artwork now felt like a home, with comfortable seating areas, bookshelves filled with both business texts and children's literature, and spaces designed for both work and play. During dinner, which was served in the informal dining area rather than the formal dining room, the conversation flowed naturally between topics ranging from Emma's school experiences to Montgomery's business decisions. She had become his unofficial advisor on matters of human relations, her insights often more valuable than those provided by his highly paid consultants. "There's a new girl at school who doesn't speak much English," Emma said, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone she used when discussing problems that needed solving. "She sits by herself at lunch because she doesn't know how to talk to the other kids." Montgomery looked up from his meal, his expression reflecting the kind of attention he used to reserve for business crises. "What do you think would help her?" "I think she needs someone to sit with her, even if they can't talk very much. Sometimes just having someone nearby makes you feel less alone." Emma's solution was characteristically simple and profound. "Maybe I could bring some of my drawing supplies and we could draw together. Art doesn't need words." The suggestion prompted Montgomery to share a story from his own childhood, a rare glimpse into the experiences that had shaped his approach to the world. He spoke about feeling isolated as a young boy, about how his family's wealth had created barriers between him and other children, about the loneliness that had driven him to seek power and control as an adult. "I wish I'd had someone like you when I was growing up," he said, his voice carrying a wistfulness that spoke to decades of buried pain. Someone who understood that being different doesn't have to mean being alone. Emma reached across the table to squeeze his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his with the confidence of someone who had learned that affection was a gift to be shared freely. "You have someone like me now," she said simply. "And I have someone like you. That's what families do. They take care of each other." The evening concluded with their established routine of reading together in the living room. Caesar stretched out on the carpet between them. Montgomery had discovered that he enjoyed children's literature, finding in the simple stories a directness and emotional honesty that was often missing from his business world. As Emma fell asleep during the 3rd chapter of their current book, Montgomery carefully carried her to her room, Caesar following behind like a devoted guardian. The sight of the powerful businessman tucking a blanket around a sleeping child, his movements gentle and protective, encapsulated the transformation that had occurred over the past 6 months. Later, as I prepared to leave for the evening, Montgomery and I stood in his office, reviewing the security arrangements for the following day. But our conversation inevitably drifted to the changes that Emma's presence had brought to his life. "I keep thinking about what she said that first day," Montgomery reflected, his voice carrying a wonder that hadn't diminished with familiarity. "About telling Caesar that she wasn't there to hurt him. The same thing she tells people. Such a simple concept, but it changed everything." He was right. Emma's approach to both animals and people was rooted in the understanding that most aggression and defensiveness comes from fear, that connection requires vulnerability, and that healing happens when someone feels truly seen and accepted. "She's taught me that leadership isn't about intimidation," Montgomery continued, his voice growing more thoughtful. "It's about creating environments where people feel safe enough to be their best selves. Caesar wasn't naturally aggressive. He was protecting himself and me from what he perceived as threats. But when Emma showed him that not everyone was a threat, he could relax and just be a dog." The parallel to Montgomery's own transformation was unmistakable. For years he had operated from a place of defensive aggression, using his wealth and power to maintain distance from others. Emma had shown him that strength could coexist with gentleness, that vulnerability was not weakness but the foundation of genuine connection. As I made my way home through the city streets, I reflected on the remarkable journey I'd witnessed. 6 months ago, William Montgomery III had been one of the most isolated people I'd ever known, surrounded by wealth and power, but lacking the human connections that give life meaning. A barefoot little girl had walked into his world and shown him that true strength came not from domination but from love, not from fear but from trust. The changes in Montgomery's life had created ripple effects that extended far beyond his personal relationships. His business practices had become more ethical and employee-focused. His philanthropic efforts had shifted from tax-strategic donations to genuine community engagement, and his entire approach to power had evolved from self-serving to service-oriented. But perhaps the most significant change was in Montgomery himself. The cold efficiency that had defined his personality for decades had been replaced by a warmth that made him not just more successful, but more human. Emma had taught him that the most important victories were not those won in boardrooms or measured in profit margins, but those that occurred in the quiet moments of connection between people who cared about each other. The story of Montgomery, Emma, and Caesar had become legend within the company, a reminder that transformation was possible at any age and in any circumstance. Employees who had once feared their boss now respected him, not just for his business acumen, but for his genuine concern for their well-being. The building that had once been a monument to corporate power had become a place where people felt valued and supported. As I reached my apartment, I realized that I had been privileged to witness something truly extraordinary. The power of unconditional love to transform not just individuals, but entire communities. Emma's simple act of compassion toward a frightened dog had created a chain reaction that had touched hundreds of lives, proving that the smallest gestures of kindness could have the most profound impact. The next morning brought new challenges and opportunities, but also the continuation of a story that had already changed so many lives. Montgomery arrived at the office with his usual punctuality, but his demeanor carried the relaxed confidence of someone who had learned to lead with both strength and compassion. Caesar walked beside him without a leash, his former aggression replaced by the calm alertness of a dog who knew he was loved rather than just needed. Emma's influence continued to ripple outward, touching everyone who encountered her unique combination of wisdom and innocence. She had taught a billionaire that money couldn't buy happiness, shown a guard dog that protection could come from love rather than fear, and demonstrated to an entire corporation that success was measured not just in profits, but in the positive impact one could have on others. The story was far from over. Each day brought new opportunities for growth, new challenges to overcome, and new connections to be made. But the foundation had been laid, a foundation built not on wealth or power, but on the simple truth that every living being deserves to be seen, understood, and loved for who they are, rather than what they can provide. In the end, Emma's greatest gift to Montgomery wasn't her ability to calm his aggressive dog or her insights into human nature. It was her demonstration that real connection transcends all the barriers that people construct around themselves. Barriers of wealth, age, experience, and fear. She had shown him that the most important things in life couldn't be bought or negotiated, but had to be given freely and received with gratitude. The transformation of William Montgomery III from isolated billionaire to loving father figure proved that it's never too late to change, never too late to learn, and never too late to discover that the most valuable treasures in life are the relationships we build with others. Emma had taught him that true wealth was measured not in dollars but in the depth of human connection, and that the most powerful force in the world was not fear or control, but the simple act of seeing someone's pain and choosing to respond with love. As I watched Montgomery and Emma walk hand in hand toward the elevator, Caesar trotting contentedly beside them, I knew that their story would continue to unfold in ways that none of us could fully predict. But I was certain of one thing. The love that had brought them together would continue to transform not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone they touched. The barefoot little girl who had walked into the lobby of Montgomery Tower had changed the world, one connection at a time, proving that kindness truly does speak louder than wealth.